Those who remember 1961 know that was the year Cleopatra's filming shook the world. Elizabeth Taylor made headlines every single day, and everyone was waiting for her next scandal. But on that cold March day, newspapers printed an entirely different story. Elizabeth Taylor is dying. When the cabin crew on a plane departing from London realized that the world's most beautiful woman couldn't breathe, history was about to change. That moment revealed just how fragile Hollywood's golden age really was, because if Elizabeth Taylor hadn't made it off that plane alive, cinema history wouldn't be written the way we know it today. More than 60 years have passed, but the terrifying moments on that flight are still talked about. Because Taylor didn't just survive, she emerged as an even more powerful icon. So what really happened on that plane? And how did this crisis launch Elizabeth's legend as the woman who came back from death? If you want to hear this story through to the end, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. Because nothing in Elizabeth Taylor's life was a coincidence, and this was only the beginning. In early 1961, 20th Century Fox Studios was preparing for the most expensive film in history. Cleopatra would showcase Hollywood's grandeur to the world, bring ancient Egypt's magnificence to the silver screen, and make Elizabeth Taylor the highest-paid actress in cinema history, $1 million. It was an astronomical figure for that era, and Elizabeth believed she deserved it because she wasn't just an actress, she was a phenomenon. Pinewood Studios had been set up in London, massive sets had been constructed, and cameras had started rolling, but nobody knew that this production would bring Hollywood to the brink of bankruptcy and nearly kill Elizabeth Taylor. London's cold and damp winter days were completely unsuitable for filming. While Elizabeth Taylor shivered beneath her costume, producers were panicking because they were falling behind schedule. Every lost day meant lost money, and Taylor's illness was the biggest threat stopping this expensive machine. But Elizabeth wouldn't stop because she was a star who never compromised on professionalism. She woke up early every morning, sat in the makeup chair for hours, put on heavy costumes and worked 12 hours a day on cold sets. Exhaustion had seeped into her bones, but she didn't show it to anyone because Elizabeth Taylor was a woman who didn't know how to display weakness. However, her body was no longer listening, and when the first symptoms appeared in early March, everyone thought it was just a mild cold. They would realize how wrong they were far too late. First came the cough, then a slight fever. Elizabeth downplayed it because stars didn't have time to be sick, and the Cleopatra shoot was consuming more money with each passing day. Set doctors wrote her prescriptions, told her to rest, but Elizabeth didn't listen. Another week passed and her condition worsened instead of improving. Her fever rose, her cough intensified, and she began having trouble breathing. But she still went to the set because Elizabeth Taylor was a machine that didn't know how to stop, until her body stopped her. By mid-March, Elizabeth could no longer get out of bed. Her fever had exceeded 104 degrees, her lungs had filled with fluid, and the doctors finally understood the truth. This wasn't just a cold, it was severe pneumonia, and Elizabeth Taylor's life was in danger. Production at Pinewood Studios ground to a halt. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. Hundreds of people were left without work. But most importantly, the world's most famous face now looked so pale and exhausted it was barely recognizable. Elizabeth's manager, producers, and studio executives gathered at the hospital because if Elizabeth died, the Cleopatra film would die too, and Fox Studios would go bankrupt. But at that moment, nobody knew just how bad Elizabeth's condition really was. While doctors at the London hospital tried to stabilize her, another decision was made. Elizabeth Taylor needed to be taken to America because treatment might be better there. And that decision marked the beginning of when everything spiraled out of control. Toward the end of March 1961, Elizabeth Taylor was placed on a plane bound from London to New York. Her condition was critical, but doctors believed she could withstand the journey. She had a medical team with her, oxygen tanks were ready, and every precaution had been taken for emergencies. However, nobody had fully calculated how the atmospheric pressure and thin air at 30,000 feet would affect Elizabeth's already weakened lungs. A few hours after the plane took off, the cabin crew noticed something was going wrong. Elizabeth's breathing had become irregular, her face was ashen pale, and her pulse was dangerously slow. The cabin pressure was straining her already congested lungs even more, and her body couldn't take it anymore. The medical team was panicking but trying to maintain their professionalism. An oxygen mask was applied. Intravenous medications were administered, and Elizabeth's vital signs were constantly monitored. But it wasn't enough because Elizabeth Taylor was now unconscious, and her lips were beginning to turn blue. The other passengers in the cabin didn't know exactly what was happening, but they could sense something was very wrong because the cabin crew was rushing around frantically, and the pilot was going back and forth to the cockpit. Then the announcement came. Due to a medical emergency, we will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. In that moment, everyone understood the truth. Someone on the plane was dying, and that someone was Elizabeth Taylor. The pilots received clearance for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. The plane began descending rapidly, and the tension inside the cabin became almost palpable. Elizabeth's manager tried to calm her by holding her hand, but Elizabeth couldn't hear anything anymore. Her eyes were closed, her breathing had nearly stopped, and the medical team was preparing to begin CPR. When the plane parked on the runway, ambulances were already waiting because word had been radioed ahead. Elizabeth Taylor was on her deathbed, and even a few minutes could be too late. The stretcher was quickly removed from the plane. Elizabeth's motionless body was placed in the ambulance, and amid the sound of sirens, they rushed toward the hospital. In that moment, the world held its breath because nobody knew if Elizabeth Taylor would survive. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors understood just how critical the situation was. Elizabeth's lungs were almost completely filled with fluid. She couldn't breathe, and her oxygen levels were dangerously low. In the emergency room, the most experienced team assembled because this wasn't just about saving a patient's life. It was about not losing Hollywood history's biggest star. The decision was made. A tracheotomy would be performed. That meant an incision would be made in Elizabeth's throat, a tube would be placed directly into her windpipe, and air would be pumped into her lungs. This was the last chance. If this procedure failed, Elizabeth Taylor would die that night, and the world would never see her again. The operating room was filled with a silent but tense atmosphere. As doctors determined where to make the incision in Elizabeth's throat, press members were beginning to gather outside because word had leaked. Elizabeth Taylor was dying. A tracheotomy was a routine procedure under normal circumstances, but Elizabeth's situation was anything but normal. Her body was weakened, her immune system had collapsed, and even the slightest complication could be fatal. But there was no other option. The surgical blade touched Elizabeth's delicate neck and the incision was made. Blood flowed, the tube was placed, and the first air pump to her lungs began. Everyone waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, and then Elizabeth's chest rose slightly. She was breathing. There was a chance of survival. But the danger hadn't passed yet. Elizabeth remained in intensive care for days, was officially listed as being in critical condition, and the press constantly waited at the hospital entrance. One news agency mistakenly announced that Elizabeth had died, and this news spread worldwide. A correction was issued a few hours later, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen just how thin the line was between Elizabeth Taylor and death. During those days in the hospital, Elizabeth was reading her own death notices, and for her, it was a surreal experience. Years later, she would say in an interview, "In those days, they thought I had died many times over. I felt that way too. I couldn't breathe, and every second felt like it might be my last." Elizabeth now had a permanent mark on her neck. The tracheotomy scar would remain there for the rest of her life, and that scar would become physical proof of her legend as the woman who came back from death. Hollywood would try to ignore this mark. Makeup artists would cover it. Photographers would change angles, and cameras would be carefully positioned. But Elizabeth didn't hide that scar. On the contrary, she wore it as a symbol of power, because that mark was a sign of survival, of being strong, and of defying death. After that terrible night in 1961, Elizabeth Taylor was no longer just an actress. She was a symbol of survival. As news of Elizabeth's crisis spread worldwide, the media went into a frenzy. Newspapers ran headlines like "Elizabeth Taylor dying." Radio stations provided constant updates, and television channels broadcast live from outside the hospital. Social media didn't exist in 1961, but the speed at which news spread was so great that Elizabeth's condition became a global event. One news agency hastily announced that Elizabeth had died, and this news was accepted as true for hours. The world thought it had lost Hollywood's brightest star. But then the correction came. Elizabeth Taylor was still alive, in critical condition, but fighting. This false death report added another layer to Elizabeth's legend. Now she wasn't just a beautiful actress. She was a hero who had returned from death. The press followed her every move. Doctors held constant press conferences, and fans prayed outside the hospital. Elizabeth's condition wasn't just a health crisis. It was a global event because she was a symbol of everything Hollywood represented: beauty, wealth, power, and fragility. And now the world was seeing just how fragile that symbol was. The days spent in the hospital turned into a nightmare for Elizabeth. She was constantly hooked up to machines. The tube in her throat allowed her to breathe but was also painful, and she couldn't speak. Doctors explained how severe the pneumonia was. Her lungs were almost completely filled with fluid. The infection had spread, and the recovery process would be long and difficult. But Elizabeth didn't give up. As days passed, her condition slowly stabilized. Her fever dropped, her breathing improved, and finally doctors made this announcement: Elizabeth Taylor is out of danger. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Hollywood's queen was coming back. Newspapers of that era frequently used the phrase electronic lung, and this showed just how primitive yet miraculous 1960s medical technology was. The devices used to keep Elizabeth Taylor alive were simple by today's standards, but they were cutting-edge technology for that time. Mechanical ventilators, oxygen machines, and intensive care protocols kept Elizabeth's lungs functioning. Period news stories ran headlines like "Breathing thanks to electronic lung," and this generated tremendous public interest. Because Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just an actress, she was a living example demonstrating the power of science and medicine. During the weeks she spent in the hospital, Elizabeth thought about many things: her life, her career, her marriages, and what she had missed. At that time she was in her fourth marriage, and her relationship with Eddie Fisher was turbulent. But in that hospital bed, none of it mattered, because Elizabeth had faced death, and this experience had changed her. Years later she would say, "In those days I saw death, and it wasn't terrible, but I chose to come back because I still had so much to do." These words perfectly captured Elizabeth's state of mind. She was a fighter who chose to survive. The recovery process was slow but determined. Elizabeth received physical therapy, did lung exercises, and gradually gained strength. Doctors said full recovery would take months, but the Cleopatra production couldn't wait. The studio decided to move filming to Rome and expected Elizabeth to return to the set as soon as she recovered. And Elizabeth did return, because she was Hollywood's most powerful woman, and not even death could stop her. In late 1961, Elizabeth Taylor attended the Academy Awards. She had received a Best Actress nomination for her performance in Butterfield 8, and that night she won. When she walked onto the stage, she was wearing a white dress, and the tracheotomy scar on her neck was slightly visible. Some thought she won this Oscar through sympathy vote, because the media had emphasized her return from death so much that Academy members might have been influenced. But Elizabeth didn't care. That Oscar wasn't just an award, it was a symbol of survival. When she took the stage, she couldn't hold back her tears, and in her speech she said, "I never expected to receive this award, because a few months ago, I didn't even know if I'd be here tonight." That night, Elizabeth Taylor's story was rewritten. She was no longer just a beautiful actress. She was a legend who had returned from death. The media followed her every move. Fans loved her even more, and Hollywood once again acknowledged her power. But in Elizabeth's mind, the memories from that flight were still fresh. The feeling of not being able to breathe, the pain of the incision in her throat, and sensing how close death was. This experience had changed her, and in the years that followed, Elizabeth Taylor would become a more courageous, stronger, and more determined woman. The new Cleopatra sets established in Rome were far more magnificent and expensive than those in London. 20th Century Fox had put everything on the line to save the production, and Elizabeth Taylor returned to the set as soon as she recovered. But this time everything was different. Elizabeth was now a woman who had faced death, and this gave her a different kind of power. There was also a new face on set, Richard Burton. He would play the role of Mark Antony in Cleopatra, and would change Elizabeth's life forever. But that's another story. For now, we know how Elizabeth Taylor survived that terrible crisis in 1961, and this story is the strongest reason she became known in Hollywood as the woman who came back from death. That flight in 1961 was a turning point for Elizabeth Taylor. Facing death had shown her how short and precious life was. In the years that followed, Elizabeth would live more passionately, more riskily, and more freely. Her forbidden love with Richard Burton would become one of Hollywood's biggest scandals. The Cleopatra film would nearly bankrupt Fox Studios, and Elizabeth's life would continue in constant turmoil. But nothing would be as real as that death scare on that March night in 1961. Because that night, Elizabeth Taylor could have really died. And if she had, Hollywood history would be very different today. When Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011 at age 79, the world remembered her as a legend. She left behind a life filled with 8 marriages, dozens of films, a jewelry collection worth millions of dollars, and AIDS activism. But one of the most powerful pieces of her legend was that death threat in 1961. Because that night, Elizabeth Taylor became not just an actress but a symbol of survival. The tracheotomy scar on her neck remained there for the rest of her life, and that scar was physical proof of her strength, courage, and never-give-up spirit. The Cleopatra film was finally completed and released in 1963. Critics gave mixed reviews, but the film was successful at the box office and Elizabeth Taylor's performance went down in history. But the film's real legacy was the drama behind the production, the cost that nearly bankrupted a studio, Elizabeth's battle with death, and the forbidden love that began with Richard Burton. All of this made Cleopatra not just a film but one of Hollywood history's biggest events. Elizabeth Taylor's survival from the 1961 crisis wasn't just a medical miracle. It was proof of her inner strength, her will to hold on to life, and her character that never gave up. If she had died on that flight, the world would have remembered her only as a beautiful actress. But she survived, and in the years that followed, Elizabeth Taylor became known not only for her beauty but for her strength. The title, The Woman Who Came Back from Death, wasn't just given to her by the media. She earned it with her own life, and today, more than 60 years later, that terrible night in 1961 is still being told. Because this story isn't just about a celebrity's health crisis, it's the story of human spirit's resilience, Hollywood's dark side, and the birth of a legend. Elizabeth Taylor didn't die that night, and because of that, her legacy will live forever.